Good morning. My name is the Reverend Doug Wadkins, and I'd like to welcome our Unitarian Universalists Church of Sarasota and our Lakewood Ranch Unitarian Universalists, as well as our visitors. We begin this morning with a prelude by Don Brin and some announcements. And so we'll see you back here in just a moment. We offer a very special welcome to our visitors this morning. We are glad that you joined us. We hope that while you are with us, you will, on the website, go to the front page and click on the banner entitled Welcome Visitors. That will take you to some information that is helpful to getting to know more about Unitarian Universalism and this congregation. We also hope that you'll take a moment to sign our virtual guest book. That will get you our weekly newsletter entitled The Contact, which gives you a lot of the events, including the links to Zoom to our various meetings and gatherings throughout the week. In order to get to know us better, I hope as you are able, you will join us for some of those gatherings as well. You'll also see on the front page a donate button. Even during the pandemic, especially during the pandemic, we continue to employ all of our staff to offer an entire set of programming throughout the week and pastoral care, as well as the service this Sunday. Your support of us is incredibly important during this time, and so we appreciate your generosity very much. After the service, we will have a virtual coffee hour together on Zoom. That'll give us a chance to say hello to each other, and we do breakout rooms for a few minutes so that in smaller groups you can catch each other up on what's happening in your week. You can receive a link to that, if you don't already have it, by signing up on our contact newsletter, and it's the same link that you use for the rest of the Sunday morning offerings. Finally, this afternoon at 2 p.m., we will have a focused conversation about the proposed 8th principle. If you signed up, you'll receive a link to be a part of that conversation. But there are other conversations coming up that you'll see there on the marquee. And if you sign up for those, you can join us. Each of these conversations uses the same structure, but because different people will be involved, the conversation will be as unique as those who are gathered in the conversation. You're welcome to sign up for one, we hope you will, or any of them to hear the variety of questions and comments. In just a moment, we will move into our chalice lighting. And so I invite you, if you haven't yet, to find a candle, or if you happen to have a chalice there at home, so that you can join us in the chalice lighting. Atticus Palmer wrote, "We call this light before us in hope that we may always remain a strong community, working together to make the world a better place. When we are grieving or sad, when we are challenged, when we need help, this flame guides us out of the murkiness of life. When we are cheerful, when we celebrate, when we accomplish a great task, we return to a place that makes us joyful and happy. This chalice reminds us to share our celebrations and happiness with others." And so now I invite you at home and here to light this chalice. This morning we light it in the spirit of the first principle, affirming and promoting the inherent worth and dignity of every person. I invite you to join us now in our opening hymn, hymn number 407. We're going to sit at the welcome table.
We're gonna sit at the welcome table. We're gonna sit at the welcome table one of these days, hallelujah. We're gonna sit at the welcome table. Gonna sit at the welcome table one of these days. All kinds of people around that table.
We move more deeply into our service in a time of centering. We begin with centering in words, and this week, this day, is Valentine's Day. And the original intent of that holiday had more to do with honoring all of the manifestations of love that we participate in life. And so we acknowledge that whatever is true in your life, you still are a part of the ongoing process of connecting and loving one another. This reading by Kristen Harper is meant to honor all the ways that we become more connected. The breath of life is not mine alone. I do not wish to breathe another breath if it is not shared with others. The breath of life is not mine alone. I brought myself to be with you hoping that by inhaling the compassion, the courage, the hope found here, I can exhale the fear, the selfishness, the separateness I keep so close to my skin. I cannot live another moment, at least not one of joy, unless you and I find our oneness somewhere among each other, somewhere between the noise, somewhere within the silence of the next breath. I invite you for a few moments to join us in a time of quiet, and then at the end of it, to join your voice with ours as we sing Spirit of Life.
Spirit of life, come unto me. Sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion. Blow in the wind, rise in the sea. Move in the hand, giving life and shape of justice. Roots hold me close, winds set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me.
We have a reading this morning entitled Beloved Community Is by Alex Capitan and Michael Slack. Beloved community is when we say we, and we mean everyone. Beloved community is not homogeneous. It can't be. When commonality is presumed, when we make assumptions about who's present and whether people are like us or not, we're not practicing beloved community. Because beloved community doesn't make those assumptions. It doesn't presume commonality or a sense of being homogeneous. Another thing that beloved community is not like-minded. Because we're not called to be like-minded in spiritual community. We are called to be like-hearted. And finally, beloved community is not devoid of conflict. And this one is also really hard. Beloved community is not easy. There's nothing easy about practicing beloved community. When we avoid conflict in order to get along, we're not practicing beloved community because it exists when we trust each other, when we have real relationships, the strong enough relationships to actually disagree with each other, to be in conflict, to even risk hurting each other. And we can stay in relationship through those disagreements and conflict and potential hurt. That is practicing beloved community. I invite you now to reflect some more as we hear our Mass choir sing "We Begin Again in Love."
For remaining silent when a single voice would have made a difference.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For each time that our fears have made us rigid and inaccessible,
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For each time we have struck out in anger without just cause.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For each time that our greed has blinded us to the needs of others.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For the selfishness that sets us apart and alone.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For falling short of the admonitions of the Spirit, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For losing sight of our unity.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For those and for so many acts, both evident and subtle, which have fueled the illusions of separateness.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
As we seek beloved community, we are often invited to do that which we already intend to do and seek, but to bring it into greater alignment with our larger ideals at the very core of who we are. And often it asks us to do things that seem at first very difficult, to connect with people unconditionally, with an open mind and an open heart. But the truth is that you have been practicing that for a very long time with each other. One of the stories that you most often have shared with me as I've gotten to know you is how by being together working on committees, meeting over the weeks into months in coffee hour, in being part of small groups together, people who originally were strangers to you became friends. And one of the things that you have said again and again that is actually a good thing about this time of pandemic is that the Zoom meetings have often allowed you to encounter new friends within this community that you might never have interacted with even in an in-person Sunday morning coffee hour. By being thrown together, as you said, into a Zoom room, especially over time, you build a deeper sense of that other person so that they are no longer the unknown. By its very nature, beloved community seeks to change how one relates to the world, opening up the stories we know about how the world actually works here and now. And often those stories are the stories of people that we learn one at a time. And so there are an infinite number of stories that come together to make up a fuller understanding of beloved community. For a few minutes, I want to reflect on some of the pathways to understanding, connecting, and engaging this theme. I hope that one of these connection points offers you that opportunity, but there are so many more. There are so many ways that beloved community makes itself known, so one sermon or even a month of sermons can't illustrate them all. Throughout them, a lot of it has to do with a strong connection with our sense of compassion and justice. And that's because the strands of meaning come together to shape very old ideals. And the idea of a deeper community flows in the midst of and is made alive in the human spirit. That is not a new story, but a very old one. There are many sources of connection, and Over and over again, beloved community shows those connections between faith traditions and the human family itself. So we begin with the first strand of connection, beloved community and loving the stranger. Rabbi Lori Schaller wrote, "Being in beloved community means going beyond tolerance and our capacity to be extravagantly welcoming. It means really loving the stranger, whether or not you agree with her, his, their values." At its best, our faith tradition has moved us again and again to an expansive sense of hospitality. The thing is, we often think of hospitality as the way that we welcome people in to our spaces and make them feel like they are a part of our lives. But we've begun to learn how over and over we are also called to journey outward, to go experience people where they are, where they live, and know more about what it means to be deeply connected to the larger world. It reminds me of the story of Doug Shipman, a community organizer in the Atlanta area, and he talks about how, as an 18-year-old young man from Arkansas, one Sunday he took the MARTA bus in Atlanta to Ebenezer Baptist Church, the congregation where Martin Luther King Jr. preached. He thought of it as a sort of pilgrimage because he had such deep esteem for Martin Luther King's career. And he was nervous when he got into the sanctuary, being the only white person in sight. But he was grateful and comforted to discover that the opening hymn was the same one that he had sung many times in his home congregation in Arkansas. And it turned out that he knew the second hymn and gratefully finally the closing hymn as well. And then when the service ended, the people around him turned to him and started a conversation that really had the common theme that they were surprised that this white guy, this young white guy, knew all of the same hymns that they had sung. And he shared about how happy he was that he knew those songs from his congregation. And they shared a little bit about why they valued being part of the church. And at the end of it, he felt like even from that initial engagement that he wanted more. And so it brought him back the next week where he learned more stories and made more connections. And eventually it began to change his perspective. It helped him know about an entirely different layer of life within the city of Atlanta. But then eventually it began to change his life. He began to find himself thinking about how important this work was, and he felt himself called to move in the direction of making community service his life's calling. At the end of sharing the story, he concluded that level of engagement is more than a visit. That's actually what it means to be a neighbor. So many faith traditions and so many people engage in justice work, and they realize that such pathways of change are actually encounters with a very powerful kind of love. The sort of love that transforms lives and changes people from people we feel no connection with to people that we wish the very best for and are willing to act in agency to create that good for them. And in the process of moving from stranger to one who is known, we expand our stories of the world that we live in. And we let our lived wisdom begin to connect with the stories of our own lives. Our own tradition has taken very seriously the power of the variety of ways that we know wisdom and truth. And so our principles embrace the wisdom and certainly the sources of our wisdom that we draw on in our tradition. You see them before you now, from direct experience of transcending mystery in our lives, to the words and deeds of prophetic people, to the wisdom of world religions, including Jewish and Christian teachings, and humanist teachings, and spiritual teachings. We have learned that these variety of sources connect us not only with ideas, but with stories and people themselves, and that makes us wiser and stronger. It is, as Bell Hooks reminds us, beloved community is formed not by the eradication of difference, but by its affirmation, by each of us claiming the identities and cultural legacies that shape who we are and how we live in the world. And so by doing that with more and more depth, another theme that Beloved Community offers to us is beloved community and loving your enemy. Sometimes we are actually to move even deeper and ultimately into a kind of love and community that is highly liberating. The story of Ruby Sales, who is the founder and director of the Spirit House Project in Atlanta and is also on the oral history recordings of the civil rights movement at the Smithsonian, was in an On Being podcast, and she shared this story. I became involved in the Southern Freedom Movement not merely because I was angry about injustice, but because I loved the idea of justice. So it's where you begin your conversation. Most people begin their conversation with, I hate this, but they never talk about what it is that they love. And so I think we have to begin to have a conversation that incorporates a vision of love with a vision of outrage. I don't see these things as being over and against each other. I grew up in a folk tradition that positioned us to stand against the wind of Southern apartheid. Our parents were spiritual geniuses who created a world and a language where the notion that I was inadequate or inferior or less than never touched my consciousness. I grew up believing that I was a first-class human being and a first-class person. Our parents were spiritual geniuses who taught us something serene about love. An old song goes, I love everybody. I love everybody in my heart. And so, hate was not anything in our vocabulary. I knew and I know that I can't control the world, but I can control myself, my internal life. And you are not going to coerce me into hating. Now, this work of being able to have love for people for whom we have great difficult feelings is not easy work. And very often we will not do as well at it as we might wish. And yet it is work that is worthy of continued practice. Because over time it helps teach us the difference between justified negative energy and that turns into the energy of righteous anger that may inspire change, and the ways that one's hatred can rob us of energy, can help us be detached from our wholeness, and can trap us in the past. This is true in our personal lives. It's true in how we seek justice together. It's true in community as well. In my newsletter article a few weeks ago, I referred to how important the concept of beloved community is to Martin Luther King Jr. And then in the midst of his difficult work, Robert Harvey reminds us that behind King's conception of beloved community is the idea in the Gospel of Matthew of love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. To him, that sets up this idea of an inescapable network of mutuality that finds its meaning most clearly in this way, as King said. Whether we realize it or not, each of us lives eternally in the red. Recognition of one's indebtedness to past generations should inhibit the sense of self-sufficiency and promote awareness that personal growth cannot take place apart from meaningful relationships with the other person, that the I cannot attain fulfillment without the thou. And so we are gifted by the power of our collective history in those stories if we will but utilize it. It brings me to the last major connection point I want to share today. Beloved community as a spiritual practice. Drawing on Victoria Safford's words, the beloved community is not a goal or destination. It was not any kind of idealistic Christian utopian dream, but instead a way of being, spiritually, politically, economically, emotionally, intellectually. Beloved community is an attitude, an orientation of the heart. It's a disciplined understanding of our own relationship to other people, to everyone else on the planet, to every living thing. If you are religious, this is a religious discipline, and it goes by many names. If you are seeking spiritual wholeness, spiritual balance, it is a spiritual discipline. If you are an ethical humanist, it is a deliberate moral stance. It is a daily practice, a spiritual politics that requires inclusivity, nonviolence, the hard discipline of radical hospitality. It requires love, agape. I was reminded how many practices that we already have as a part of our toolkit may be helpful in building beloved community and doing its most powerful and difficult work. I think about my own mindfulness practice and the writings of Annie Gonzalez Milliken when she reminds us of the power of using mindfulness in terms of dealing with places where we feel discomfort. She was writing initially about how white people, in the midst of exploring and celebrating and honoring the work for racial justice, find places of discomfort and how to live more powerfully with that. But I realize that in so many ways, when we encounter our discomfort, these sets of skills are powerful. She reminds us of the ability and the call to sit with discomfort, saying that Buddhism is very clear in the wisdom of, rather than trying to run away from or distance ourselves from places of discomfort, to allow ourselves to sit with it, to not allow ourselves to be overcome with it, but to let it speak to us more powerfully. And in particular, when we feel ourselves wanting to have judgment, either about ourselves or each other, instead to turn to curiosity, including with the discomfort. What else is going on underneath this discomfort? What might it teach me? And when we find ourselves not knowing some things that we think perhaps we should know, we can find ways to get those answers. She says that one of the powers of the internet these days is that a simple Google search on a lot of different subjects can tell us much about other people's experiences and why it is that they may feel the way that they do. And it invites us to stay focused on the big picture. So often we get caught up in the minutia of something and let it overcome what it is that we are trying to do in the larger sense, what a bigger perspective might ask of us. I'm aware how many times again and again, by having the ability to sit with discomfort, to learn about it, to let it lead us to a larger perspective, how often in human interactions there may be more learning and more love than we ever know possible. Most of all, I am aware in thinking about beloved community, how it is that we find in it examples that remind us of the best and most powerful of who we are. Sometimes we encounter them in ways that we don't even expect, just by living into the core of what it means to really be connected to each other. I think about years ago in a congregation that I served for over a decade, that we had the tradition every week, if someone was leaving us after being a part of our community for whatever reason, usually because they were moving somewhere else, we would take a moment to wish them well and give them a small chalice as a gift to remember us by. And one of the Sundays, we were honoring that a 93-year-old member of the congregation, Frank, was leaving. Now, Frank had been a member of the congregation long before I was a member of the congregation and served them for about 20 years. And many people in the congregation knew that the heart of the reason that Frank needed to leave was not because he wished to, but as his health was beginning to fail, he felt that he needed to be closer to his family so that he had those resources. But they knew that it was an incredibly sad moment for him to leave. Not only for him, but for the community. He had long been very generous in his love and connection. And so as I invited people to stand as they were able, I realized that it was not intentional, but that I had picked Frank's favorite hymn, come sing a song with me as our closing hymn. And so I pointed it out to them that it was an unintended honoring of our connection with Frank as we sang. And as we began to sing together, I noticed that two young women across the way from Frank, without any prompting, found themselves moving over towards him. And they just very simply stood on each side of him and gently placed their hands around his shoulders as we sang together. And the people right around those young women and Frank noticed that. And again, something in them called them to reach forward, and they gently either touched Frank, or if they couldn't reach him, one of the women. And as we continue to sing the words, "And I'll bring you hope when hope is hard to find, and I'll sing a song of love and a rose in the winter time," as we came to that final verse, person after person in those 400 people in that congregation had found themselves reaching out to the person in front of them, so that at the end of the song, we were one large connected chain of human touch. Even people who didn't know Frank could understand the power of a goodbye and the loss, and also the love of life itself. And in that moment, when that hymn ended, the entire space was connected with this deep, abiding sense of community and solidarity in the very humanness of who we are together. It is such a gift that we journey together and that we form loving connections in our life. How might you be continuing the life-giving practice of finding humanity in each person and learning the deeper craft of being a neighbor on this planet and creating beloved community within this community? May that exploration, may that work be a blessing to us on this Valentine's Day. I invite you to join us in the closing hymn, hymn number 34, "Though I May Speak with Bravest Fire."
Though I may speak with bravest fire, and have the gift to all inspire, and have not love, my words are vain, as sounding brass and hopeless gain. Though I may give all I possess, and striving soul my love profess, but not take in my love within, the prophet soon turns strangely thin. Come, Spirit, come, our hearts control, our spirits long to be made whole. Let inward love guide every need. By this we worship and are freed.
In a moment, we will extinguish our chalice. And now, may we be dedicated to nurturing the light of community. For the power of good in each of us at times will waver. But when a group together is dedicated to nurturing the power of good, it is rare that the light and celebration of life will dim in all individuals at the same moment. And so we borrow courage and wisdom for one another to embolden love and keep us until we are together again. we extinguish this chalice, but not the light of greater wisdom, not the warmth of love, compassion, and connection, not the fire of our commitment to justice. These remain until we gather together again. May you have a happy Valentine's Day, and we'll see you here next week.